I was born in 1956, which was just 11 years after the end of World War II. So the adults who filled my childhood days had all come of age either before or during World War II. Oddly enough, though, the people, at least in my world, didn't talk about the war very often. It must have been a horrifying nightmare for them, but they elected to speak of it only rarely, and when they did, it was usually below the hearing of children. I know that my father fought in the South Pacific, where he said everyone that he went into basic training with was killed during the war. Also, during the war, my mother was a part of that huge typing pool of thousands of other congressional secretaries in Washington, D.C. After the war, my father was hospitalized in the mental ward of the Bethesda Hospital, where he was being treated for what they called at the time battle fatigue, what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Oddly enough, it was during that time that my father was a mental patient that mutual friends introduced my mother to my father. And when my father was released, Mom and Dad got married in a park in Washington, D.C., and they moved back to Kentucky to raise a family. My father took a job with the REA, the Rural Electrical Association, building the power grid in the American South, and he continued to work for them until he retired. My mother became our church's secretary. My father's nerves never really got a lot better. He stuttered terribly. He had occasional night terrors, and sometimes he had to have surgery to remove little bits of exploded shrapnel from his body, though he said that he had no memory of having been in a bomb blast. He even had a few relapses of malaria that I can remember, but my father never told war stories, and I suppose I should be grateful for that. They had experienced a lot during the war years, but my mom and dad came back to their hillbilly roots in Kentucky and brought with them, in spite of their world travels and international experiences, they retained all of the racial prejudice, anti-Semitism, even anti-Catholic feelings that they had been raised with. But thankfully, they rarely brought any of that up. There were some embarrassing things said when schools and city parks and pools were integrated, and some genuinely stupid things said about Robert Kennedy's run for president. But mostly they avoided passing their worst prejudices onto their kids. When I got married in 1976, I married into another Southern family. My father-in-law, however, was a different kind of veteran from my father. He had been an airplane mechanic stationed in Europe during the war, and he told war stories all the time, even though he was never near a battlefield. He was proud of his military service, attended all the reunions and veterans events that my father assiduously avoided. And boy howdy, my in-laws were racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-communist, and vehemently anti-Democratic Party, and yet they were very, very, very devout Christians who believed that they were members of the only true church. They weren't very fond of me for obvious reasons, but they could occasionally be heard to utter some consolation to themselves that at least their daughter had married a white man. So I spent about a decade trying to convince them that I was part black. It was a hard sale, but I tried my best. Holiday visits were hard for me to take, and one year I just couldn't take the combination of war stories and racism anymore, and I asked, why did you fight against the Nazis since you agree so passionately with their core beliefs? It was a sincere question. I wasn't trying to start a fight, even though one got started. From what little I knew about the Nazis and what I knew way too much about my in-laws' prejudices among the whole Mississippi tribe, it seemed to me that they would have fit right in to Nazi Germany. But from that unpleasant conversation, which was the last time I visited my in-laws, until just the last few years, I never thought again about the roots of fascism in Americans. I assumed that the racism in my own family and among my in-laws was purely a product of a lack of education and their own feelings of inferiority. And I never tried to dig any deeper to understand that any better. I also grew up with some real holes in my own education. In undergraduate school, I studied Greek philosophy. I had taken CLEP tests, so I clept out of all the basic history courses that I otherwise would have found the opportunity to sit in a classroom and at least hear a professor talk about modern history. In grad school, I studied biblical history, theology, church history, and even with 3 degrees and a dozen years of classroom education, my knowledge of early 20th century world history could have fit into a thimble and had plenty of room to be shaken around. My awareness of American history really didn't begin until this century, when I had a chance to hear the American historian Howard Zinn lecturing at Missouri State University. I then devoured his book, A People's History of the United States, and I had subsequent opportunities to both hear him and the opportunity to spend time in conversation with him when I was a fellow at Harvard and later when I was teaching at Drury University. When I started the little progressive church where I've worked these past 16 years, our first adult class was a 9-month study of Howard Zinn's book because I wanted the whole congregation to be aware of the truth about Christopher Columbus, the genocide of Native Americans, about our history of child labor, poverty, women's rights, civil rights, and our nation's deep history of racism, sexism, classism, and American nationalism. I realized that my public school education in history had been what my old friend, Dr. Joe McAdoo, used to call a home on the range version of history, where ne'er is heard a discouraging word. The book I'm picturing here with Zinn's book is a more flat-footed attempt at demythologizing the lies that we were told in school that tended to foster our belief that Americans were somehow uniquely the good guys in every conflict we've ever been in. I think that lies, however, might be a bit of a strong term. I suspect that my teachers were not so much lying to me as they were simply repeating the version of history that they had been taught. I don't have too much room to complain about that, since I spent the first 15 years of my life in ministry repeating most of the myths that I had been told as a child, even long after I'd been to graduate school and knew how much balloon juice the church was filled with. In 2008, when I started this little progressive church that I still work with, I emptied an entire file cabinet of my earlier sermons into a dumpster so that no evidence would remain of my own history of perpetuating inexcusable religious myths. When you look behind the cheap two-dimensional stage props of the religion and national history that most of us were taught as children, you can discover some very disappointing things about the rise of the American empire and the firm establishment of white male hetero privilege. Just a decade ago, one of our listeners turned me on to another important chapter of American history when he suggested that I read General Smedley Butler's book, War is a Racket. And if you're a regular listener, you will have heard me mention him and this short book several times. Calling it a book is actually a bit generous. It's only 60 pages long, and it has lots of pictures in it. But I'm still saying that everyone should read it. You can get all the way through it in a single cup of coffee if you try, but you will never forget what you've read. Robert De Niro played a character based on Smedley Butler in the recent movie Amsterdam. But even though I would recommend the movie to you, and I would, it's enjoyable, it's a good movie, at least 90% of it was pure fiction. Still, it preserved at least a kernel of truth about the fact that American corporate billionaires tried to raise an army of disenfranchised military veterans to overthrow our government during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, and they tried to get Smedley Butler to lead that army. Instead, Butler cleverly led them along, gathering names and information until he was ready to expose their treasonous plot to Congress, where, though the plot was foiled, not a single billionaire was ever indicted, tried, or imprisoned. Because, well, this is America. And several members of Congress were also part of the plot and were also being paid by those same corporate billionaires, if not directly by the German government. The movie rather whitewashes the whole of the story of fascism in America, but I want to try to highlight it again today. It turns out that it wasn't just my family or just my in-laws who harbored Nazi-style prejudices, and it certainly wasn't just the uneducated who promoted Hitler's agenda in America. In fact, many of the leaders were Harvard grads with otherwise important and influential careers. Sadly, it's also true that Germany pumped millions of dollars a year into bribing members of Congress to try to keep America out of the wars in Europe, as well as to spread propaganda throughout the United States. I have to say that the Germans were much more effective than Russia's more recent attempts at influencing American politics with misinformation. But now, of course, the fascist cause in America has at least two of their own TV networks who carry their water for them. We have mostly only been exposed to the tiniest tip of the iceberg of this sad dimension of our early 20th century history. And that is why I'm afraid we are being so easily seduced back into it now. So it's worth spending some time reading, studying, and thinking about our deep fascist roots to prevent it ever finding a place in America again. For example, many of us are aware that Henry Ford was anti-Semitic and that he actually kept a picture of Adolf Hitler in his office. What we probably haven't heard is that Adolf Hitler kept a picture of Henry Ford in his office and credited Henry Ford with being his inspiration for his campaign against the Jews in Europe. It turns out that my young adult quandary about why my parents and my in-laws seemed to be so proud of the American victory in World War II while holding so many beliefs of the Nazi movement in Germany was not a rare issue at all. It turns out that Nazi influence in America and America's influence on the Nazi movement had a lot of cross-pollination. I want to recommend one more book to you this morning, and while the three previously mentioned books are very important, and they certainly were seminal to my own awakening to a more honest view of American history, I'm going to say that as hard as it is to let the facts of this book into our skulls, it is well-researched, well-written, and absolutely vital information that I haven't found to appear in many other sources. In Rachel Maddow's Prequel, she carefully describes how America's post-Civil War racial apartheid inspired the racism behind Germany's anti-Semitic laws that led up to the Holocaust. Maddow's book is more than 300 pages long, and I have to admit that I've not been able to skim it for highlights the way I do a lot of modern books. This is a book that seems to demand to be read one word at a time. And if you can't see yourself doing that, I strongly suggest that you find the podcast that Rachel Maddow put up, Ultra. You can find it on iTunes or any source that you listen to podcasts on, but most of the research that went into the publication of this book, she reiterates in the podcast Ultra. I think there's 4 or 5 in the series. Seriously, please make note of this and either read the book or listen to the podcast. Now, when I read, I usually read with a pen in my hand, highlighting, underlining, putting stars in the margins of important passages. But my normal habits of marking up a book have been irrelevant in this case because I end up wanting to highlight every single line. I wish I had a photographic memory. I wish I could hold in my head all of the information that's in this book. It's important to our current political environment, not so much as a history lesson. It is a detailed example of how church-going, patriotic Americans can be seduced into supporting a totalitarian dictator because the dictator exploits their latent racism and their fear and occasionally even buys them off with favors. Maddow includes a couple of fascinating chapters about Louisiana's Huey Long, who was an authoritarian of a different populist stripe. He really did a lot to support the poor of Louisiana, gave out free textbooks in schools, built hospitals, roads, and bridges, while he twisted the law so that he could line his own pockets with millions of dollars from the public coffers. And he even managed to simultaneously be a member of the United States Senate while he was still governor of Louisiana. He loved money and power, and he knew how to get both. What I find to be so amazing about the Long historically, about Long in terms of his place in history as well as the lessons we need to learn from it, is that it was unavoidably obvious to everyone in Louisiana when he was governor and senator that Huey Long was a thug, a grifter, a pompous and corrupt person. But he was so beloved that he might well have defeated Franklin Roosevelt in a presidential race had Huey Long not been assassinated in 1935 by a young physician whose motivations were entirely unclear. This guy was not involved in politics and had himself scheduled to perform surgery the next day, but somehow slipped in among Huey Long's security guards and shot him point blank in the stomach. When he died, the Washington Post editorialized, acknowledging his popularity based on generous, popular government programs, but they added, in the career of Huey Long is epitomized the essential weakness of democracy, the pathetic willingness of the electorate to just turn a glib tongue and trust a dynamic personality. Quite justifiably, he was called a forerunner of American fascism. In the past few years, most of us have frequently wondered aloud how we could be going backwards so quickly. We've used the word unprecedented over and over and over to describe the moral outrages that have fallen on us like a hammer on an anvil, turning a blind eye to political leaders who are guilty of rape, of theft, of taking bribes and undermining democracy, of legitimizing sexism, even to the point of overturning Roe v. Wade and making it a crime to seek legal reproductive care in other states or other countries. What we need to know is that it really isn't unprecedented at all. It has happened before. And this slide into fascism has many supporters among us that we would have never, ever suspected them of having this kind of openness to a strongman political dictator. Do you remember when America elected its first black president? I sure do. But that America that we lived in those years, it doesn't seem to exist anymore. And what has taken its place should be horrifying to all of us. Maddow talks about a Roman Catholic priest, Father Charles Coughlin, who was a violently anti-Semitic priest, who actually had a radio show that drew an audience of more than 100 million people, more than anyone since or before. Coughlin insisted that what was being done to the Jews in Germany was justified and that we should be doing the same in America. He organized and inspired an armed militia that had a serious plan to overthrow the American government. They'd even managed to acquire military weapons from the United States military. Maddow also talks about the famous female pilot, second only to Amelia Earhart in fame and popularity, who is a relative of the famous author Laura Ingalls Wilder. This Laura Ingalls, the female pilot, actually flew over the White House and dropped fascist literature all over the grounds. It wasn't just that there were a lot of Nazi sympathizers in America. It is also true that Nazis learned about how to be Nazis from Americans. Hitler sent Heinrich Krieger, a German lawyer, to Fayetteville, Arkansas, to study American law to learn how could America, with a constitution that clearly forbids racial discrimination, that formally institutionalizes equality, that Americans still manage to pass and enforce Jim Crow laws, legalizing segregation, and turning a blind eye to lynching. Krieger reported to Hitler on how even after the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. took possession of Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, and the Philippines, that we still refused to give the brown people who lived there the same constitutional rights and protections afforded to white citizens on the mainland. Krieger paid special attention to the laws that made it possible to ultimately reduce the population of Native Americans from tens of millions to a few 100,000, taking their property and confining them to literal open-air prisons on reservations. Krieger spent 2 years in Arkansas and then returned to Germany to help write the laws that took citizenship and property away from German Jews, leading up to the Holocaust. In spite of our history of genocide against Native Americans, our enslavement and later segregation with all of its lynching and economic oppression of black people, and our slow acceptance of women's rights, even interracial marriage, gay rights, America didn't entirely slide into fascism in the 20th century. But this image of a fascist rally held in Madison Square Garden in 1939 should demonstrate that we certainly could have, and we came way too close to a violent overthrow of the American government when Franklin Roosevelt was in office, at least twice, and maybe more times than that. 3 years ago, inspired by the fascist rhetoric of Donald Trump, thousands stormed into the Capitol building and tried to overthrow a free and fair election, which could have resulted in installing Donald Trump as a dictator for life in America. I cannot imagine that out of some horrible fear of right-wing reprisal, Trump was not impeached and imprisoned 3 years ago. But not only has he and many other legislators and gullible citizens been allowed to avoid prosecution, Trump now stands on the threshold of being reelected, in spite of the horrifying similarities between him and Hitler and other fascist dictators. Men and women, it is not hyperbole to say that the presidential election to be held later this year may very well be the last American election if Trump is reelected. And if we do not purge our Senate and our Congress of any elected members who have tried to make the January 6th insurrection a part of a normal political process, American democracy could be lost forever. Now, I understand that churches don't want to turn their Sunday services into political rallies or discussions of current events. I recognize that almost all religious people instinctively want to hunker down and work on personal piety, moral improvement in themselves and their families, and to be supportive of one another through the vicissitudes of life. But most churches, I would remind you, were silent about slavery in the 19th century, but now we only talk about the religious leaders who stood for liberation of the slaves. Most churches in my childhood were silent about segregated schools, segregated neighborhoods and toilets, and even drinking fountains in public places. They were silent about the war in Vietnam and the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment. But we only remember and praise the religious leaders who went against that silence, kicking at the darkness. I've lost friends through the years, loudly asking in ministers' meetings, do you really believe that Jesus was crucified for being a moderate? Ministers are always afraid of losing church members if they talk about uncomfortable things in the pulpit. But what if ministers could also be afraid of losing more committed church members if they don't talk about what really matters? If your minister hasn't decried the repeal of Roe v. Wade, if they haven't stood up against book banning, the anti-trans legislation that's been passed in many states, voter suppression that's going on throughout the South, and fascist rhetoric in many right-wing politicians in the past year, as well as speaking out against Israel's war on the civilians of Gaza, then what if you gathered up your self-respect, stood up and walked out of that church and found a real church to attend? Don't ask yourself what you would have done if you had been a pastor in Germany in the 1930s, or what you would have done if you had lived in Europe during the Holocaust. What happened then is not at all remarkable when we look around us and see what is happening now. So ask yourself, what are you going to do to stop the reversal of women's rights, trans rights, gay rights? What are you doing about the book bannings, the assaults on teaching honest American history about race and slavery? How do you think that avoiding uncomfortable conversations, uncomfortable sermons, avoiding critical race theory or the truth about what really happened to Native Americans, or how many Jews tried to get out of Germany and come to America who were literally turned away by the boatloads at our own shores? How is it that avoiding thinking about that or knowing about that is helping our current situation? Jesus, Gandhi, Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., and many others gave their lives for delivering messages that got them killed. Pastors and priests in our day are silenced out of fear of being fired or of losing financial supporters. Let me tell you, I've been fired. I've been booted to the curb by the church of my birth, but I can still look at my reflection in the mirror in the morning without wanting to cut my own throat. I have a modest proposal. Why don't we get back to the business of being a prophetic church before it's too late?
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.